All right, ladies and gentlemen, at this time, I'm going to call upon Ms. Precioso.
Thank you, Your Honor. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. If a stranger breaks into a house and efficiently kills the occupant, there's no reason to move the body. The murderer can leave it right there. The murderer doesn't have to move the body because the murderer wasn't supposed to be in the house. The murderer need only to leave, and the murderer's identity remains a secret. Not the case when the murderer is the wife of the victim. She must move the body so that the illusion is created that the murderer is someone else. She needs to put the body in a place where it would open up speculation that it could be someone else and that he could have conceivably gone there. She must also create the illusion that he is still alive and that she was behaving as if she believed he was still alive. This defendant did all of that. However, the overwhelming evidence in this case dispels all illusion. The evidence presented to you in this case presents an absolutely crystal clear picture of this defendant's participation in her husband's death. At the beginning of this case, I told you that at the end of the case, I would be able to speak to you again, and I am so happy that this day has come. I want to thank you from the beginning for your patience and your attention, and I'm going to ask your indulgence one last time as I thoroughly go through the evidence again with you today. No bells and whistles, just the evidence. And I submit to you that the evidence will speak louder than any of those bells and whistles ever could. Before I sit down, I will address Mr. Tacopina's arguments, but I want to start with what I told you during my opening. I told you that it is the evidence, not conjecture, not speculation, not drama, but the evidence that should be followed and will guide you to your verdict. Bill McGuire closed on a house that he very much wanted, and after that evening when he was home in his apartment with his wife, who was carrying on a very intense love affair with another man, he was never heard from again. His cut-up body started showing up in their matching luggage, shot by bullets consistent with the gun and the bullets that she purchased just days before. In the suitcases with his remains were items that came from the apartment, specifically the weight, the trash bags, the blanket, the hairs on the tape, and the hair in the luggage. Defendant's actions in the days that follow paint a very clear picture of her guilt. Now, you know by now that the evidence in this case is almost entirely circumstantial, and the judge will instruct you on the difference between direct and circumstantial during his charge. And you will see from that instruction and from what you learned in this case that no one kind of evidence is better than the other. No one type is weaker. No one type is stronger. Evidence is evidence. And in fact, it's the quality, the persuasiveness, the compelling nature of the circumstantial evidence that can make it equal to eyewitness testimony, and in fact, and very often, even better. It makes sense that the law does not draw a distinction between the types of evidence because crimes, especially murders, are not committed in front of an audience. They're committed in secret. They're committed so they're hidden. They're committed so there would be no eyewitness. That doesn't mean that Melanie McGuire gets excused for her conduct just because there is no eyewitness. The law recognizes that persons can be convicted based solely on circumstantial evidence. What matters is not whether the evidence is direct or circumstantial. What matters is whether the state, and the burden is on me and I welcome it, whether the state has proved each and every element beyond a reasonable doubt. And the evidence you heard in this case overwhelmingly proves that Melanie McGuire is guilty of the murder of her husband. Now, in one sense, circumstantial evidence is better than eyewitness testimony. When you have to base your decision on eyewitness testimony, then you as jurors are relying on someone else's perception. You need to rely on someone else's eyesight, someone else's hearing, someone else's interpretation of a gesture. In this case, built on circumstantial evidence, you can rely on your own perceptions, on your own common sense, on your own logic. Because the facts and circumstances are here right before you, and you can look at them and examine them and draw your own conclusions. You are the ones now that have heard the facts and circumstances surrounding this murder. And you've heard the facts and circumstances about this defendant's actions. You've heard all the proof, and now it's your time to analyze it with your common sense, logic, and reasoning. And you know, we all use the power of reason every day, similar to what you're going to be doing in deliberations, and examining a case involving circumstantial evidence is no different. And by example, if you go into the mall one day and the sky is overcast, and when you come out of the mall an hour later, you see that there's a person standing at the bus stop near the front entrance to the mall, and that person has wet clothing. As you step off the curb on your way to the car, there's a puddle in the street. Now, all of this together tells you that it rained while you were in the mall. Now, by itself, the puddle alone could have been caused by someone coming outside with a bucket of water and dropping it on the street. The person with the wet clothes, that could have been caused because the person spilled something on themselves. And for each fact individually, you may be able to come up with other possibilities for why that fact exists. But when you put these other possibilities together, they evaporate, because then you see the full picture. And when you put it together, when you put together the overcast sky when you went in, the puddle in the street as you step off the curb, and the person with wet clothes at the bus stop, rain is the only logical conclusion. So too with this case. Many of the facts that you heard are powerful on their own. Some of them you heard excuses for yesterday when Mr. Tacopina spoke to you, and we're going to dispel all of those excuses before I sit down today. But when you combine them together, as reason and logic in the real world requires that you do, the conclusion is inescapable. When you combine the purchase of the bullets with the computer searches, the prescription for chloral hydrate on the same date as the searches, filled on the same date the victim disappears, filled with information the defendant had access to, specifically the information on Tiffany Bain, on prescription pads that the defendant used, filled at a drugstore 1.4 miles from where she dropped off her children just 12 minutes before that prescription was dropped off. And then you have the victim found inside their matching luggage that also contained a weight consistent with what John Rice, Bill's best friend, said that he owned, and a blanket that Mr. Lisnick told you, Mr. Lisnick from HCSC told you, is consistent with what was being supplied to RMA at the time. And combine that with trash bags that match those that we knew were inside her apartment. But let's go even further, because you still have so much more. Inside the bags, on the tape that sealed the trash bags, was both the victim's and the defendant's razor stubble. Inside the suitcase was a 10-inch hair consistent with the defendant's. Also on the tape, a chip of nail polish. But you still have more. The bullets that were removed from William McGuire's cut-up remains are consistent with the gun and with the bullets that she purchased earlier. If that isn't enough, add in the fact that she claimed she had a violent fight with her husband, yet never called the police. And then when she goes to family court for a restraining order because she is allegedly terrified, she doesn't tell the judge about the gun she purchased just 3 days earlier. Both on the confidential victim information sheet that she filled out that's dated April 29th, and when she spoke to the judge on the record on the 30th. And we're gonna go back and go over these things. And keep in mind what Detective Sergeant Dalrymple told you about that when he testified. The restraining order could have given the police the ability to search for the gun and recover it so she would be safe if she was honestly terrified when she was in front of that judge. But she didn't do that. And more importantly, what else do we know? What did she do in between her visits to family court on the 29th and the 30th? In between those visits to get a restraining order to keep her husband away from her, she makes the first of several midnight runs to Atlantic City. And what does she claim to do there? She claims she played a prank on him by moving his car that she just happens to find, not knowing where it is. She just happens to find it in this very large city of 13 casinos, numerous motels, restaurants, and shops. She just happens to find the car. She admits, and you heard it in her own voice, she admits to parking the car at the Flamingo, and then she claims to take a cab from Atlantic City to Woodbridge. And when because she couldn't find her car, and she sleeps on the way and then takes yet another cab from the Woodbridge train station back to Atlantic City.
I object. That was absolute mischaracterization of the evidence. Like you either, well, I object to that.
Mr. Takamina, the jury will use their recollection of the evidence. I've already advised counsel about
Thank
that.
you.
May I continue, Your Honor? Which all begs the question, how much cash did she take with her? And why would she have that mountain of money with her if she was simply going in her car to confront him? Another great question, if she was really going to confront him, wouldn't she have called him? According to her story, she doesn't know where he is, that he just stormed out of the house. Wouldn't she have called him? Not a single call made from the apartment or her cell phones to Bill McGuire after he left, not a single call. Consider the security tape when the car is parked at the Flamingo that shows another vehicle consistent with the defendant's Pathfinder stopping in front of where Williams' car was parked. And that, ladies and gentlemen, suggests a much more reasonable and logical scenario. That suggests to you that someone else drove down to Atlantic City with her to help her plant his car there and then drove her back. We know from Brad Miller and from the wire calls that she admitted to 2 other trips to Atlantic City, and those are just the ones she admits to, where there's easy pass hits and she has no choice but to admit to them. But we know of at least 2 other trips that she took to Atlantic City, and she told Brad Miller she was with Michael Caparero, and Brad Miller told you that she said it was to check on the car. Well, if that was the true purpose, you have to ask yourself, why was one trip at 12:54 in the morning and the other at 5:47 in the morning? But she took those 2 trips, and add on to that now that when Cindy Lagash, the victim's sister, concerned because she hadn't heard from her brother, which was very, very unusual for him, when she asked her, what's his license plate number, I'll go look for him, the defendant didn't know it. Put that together with the fact that the defendant then called E-ZPass. She calls E-ZPass customer service the day after she's interviewed by Virginia Beach detectives, later on the same day that she met those detectives at the storage facility. And remember, the day before, during the interview, she didn't own matching luggage. Then it was a mixed match set. But overnight, she recants that and tells those detectives at the storage facility, oh, we did have matching luggage. And you know what? That picture that you showed me, I'm pretty sure that's them. Well, yes, later the same day, she goes and she calls E-ZPass. And what does she say to them? I wasn't there on the 2nd and on the 18th. And it's only when E-ZPass tells her, you know, the charge stays. There was a transponder hit, the charge stays. That all of a sudden, then, later in June, and in the months that follow, she starts admitting to those trips that are on the E-ZPass record with Michael Caparero to check on the car. And what else do we know? What else can we add on to this circumstantial evidence? Inside the car is chloral hydrate in the glove compartment and Williams' flesh on the front passenger and front driver's side rug. It's in the vacuumings. Determined by DNA to be William McGuire, and according to Dr. Waugh, specifically, is not tissue normally shed by a live human being. William's flesh likely transferred from the shoes of persons that were in the room when he was cut up. And who do we know? Who do we know was in that car? This defendant. And what are the odds that the trash bags that had his body were made on the same extruder, on the same line, in a very short time of each other, of all the hundreds of trash bag manufacturers and probably the thousands of extrusion lines within those manufacturing plants that exist in this country. I submit to you, ladies and gentlemen, the odds are nil. And all of this evidence together leaves you no doubt that she participated in his murder. Circumstantial? Yes. It is also powerful, compelling, and inescapable. There is none, no reasonable scenario that takes her out of this picture. And just to be clear, as Mr. Tacopina said, don't let me say, if not her, then who? Just to be clear, you will not hear me say, if not her, then who? I want you to be assured, Melanie McGuire murdered Bill McGuire. And the evidence is overwhelming. You heard evidence that defendant was carrying on an intense love affair with Brad Miller. They told each other that they loved each other. They planned their future together. They planned to leave their spouses and be together, and they even talked about having a baby. And the stress of this decision became more pronounced around the purchase of that new house. You heard Jay Tandava and others tell you how excited Bill was about getting this house. Dr. Miller told you that the defendant had told him that he didn't think the closing was going to occur. And when it did occur, what did she tell him? What did she tell him when she called? She said, don't worry, everything will be okay. Now, Mr. Tacopina yesterday showed you some transcripts from Dr. Miller's testimony, and I submit to you that Dr. Miller said that the plan was for Melanie to leave Bill first. And if you look carefully at the questions that were put up yesterday, they were specific to at that time. At that time, had you said you were going to leave your wife? At that time, no. That's what you saw yesterday. We learned about defendant's actions before the closing. We saw the searches on her computer for search terms like how to commit a murder, gun purchases, poisons. Searches that not coincidentally coincide with prescriptions being filled at Walgreens. And don't be persuaded by any excuse that anyone other than this defendant did those searches. I'm going to come back and speak about those searches a little bit later. But these searches linked to prescriptions filled at Walgreens, and one of those prescriptions, probably the most important prescription, was for chloral hydrate, filled on the morning of April 28th, the day of the closing, 12 minutes after the defendant dropped her kids at daycare, just 1.4 miles away. And that prescription contained information on Tiffany Bain that Bill McGuire simply did not have access to. Remember when Tiffany Bain testified? She told you her birth date was right. She told you her address was right. She explained to you her phone number was off by just one digit. And why was it off by just one digit, ladies and gentlemen? That was to ensure that the pharmacy would never be able to call the real Tiffany Bain. Remember, she searched for undetectable poisons. That's one term that was researched. Dr. Jackson, George Jackson, the toxicologist, told you that the key time for calculation of a half-life is from ingestion to death. If the victim was alive but incapacitated, his body would have been processing and getting rid of that chloral hydrate. And one thing that I will agree with Mr. Tacopina on is we don't know exactly when Bill McGuire was killed. But let me digress for a minute, because I want to discuss the assertion that because there are still some things we don't know, that that's reasonable doubt, and I submit to you that it's quite the opposite. This is a murder trial to establish whether the state has proved its case beyond a reasonable doubt. It is not a contest to see if a smart she gets away with the crime. A game, it's not a test of wills, it is not a test of smarts. We have a 39-year-old man that was killed, and the burden, again, is to make sure that the state proves each and every element of that beyond a reasonable doubt. And I do need to prove that she participated in the murder. That's what I need to prove, that she participated in the murder. I don't have to prove when exactly he was killed. I don't have to prove the exact location where he took his last breath. I don't have to prove where he was cut up. I need to prove that she participated in this murder, and that New Jersey has jurisdiction, which the judge will charge you on, and I'm going to talk to you about a little later. But I don't need to prove exactly what time and where he was when he took his last breath. The evidence in this case points to a well-organized, meticulously planned execution of a murder. Think about that. Not one eyewitness, not one. Not one drop of blood, not one fingerprint recovered related to the perpetrator, not one. And that speaks to you in volumes. That tells you that the murderer was meticulous, was careful, was very well organized, and you know what? That fits the description of this defendant and how her very own friends described her. You heard Detective Pizzoro tell you that when he searched her home, her spice rack was in alphabetical order, labels facing out. Meticulous. Now, I'm going to come back to the crime scene, and we're going to spend quite a bit of time on that, but please keep in mind a few things. First, there is no doubt that prior to that first search, the first search done by Woodbridge, where Detective Piquel and Detective Juraski were there is no doubt, no one is questioning, that a family of 4, the McGuires, lived in that apartment. Detective Juraski told you that the maintenance services had not been into that apartment yet. And yet, a forensic team sent in found absolutely nothing. Nothing. You heard Lynn Van Camp, the DNA expert, tell you that she only needs a very small amount of biological material, and then they do the amplification and they could do the testing, but they only need a small bit to do DNA testing. Yet they found nothing. Not Bill's DNA, not the defendant's DNA, not the children's DNA. They found nothing. And that tells you that those bathrooms were scrubbed. And who scrubs a bathroom that thoroughly when they're moving out of an apartment? A person who is making sure that no trace, absolutely no trace, is left behind. That's who scrubs a bathroom that well. And while television and media would like to make you believe that a bloody crime scene always leaves traces behind, that's simply not the testimony that you heard in this case, and it is not reality. You heard unrefuted testimony that blood and tissue can be cleaned up. Tom Lesniak and Lynn Van Camp both told you that they do it in the laboratory every single day. Lynn Van Camp told you that the laboratory at State Police uses a 10% bleach solution to clean up between cases. And she told you that once a sample is treated with bleach, can't do DNA. You don't get anything. So consider, if you will, let's compare this meticulous defendant to this meticulous killer to determine if they are one and the same. Let's start with the killer. What do we know about the killer? We know that there are no fingerprints. Not on the bags, not on the tape, not on the suitcases. None. They were fingerprinted not only by Virginia, they were fingerprinted by New Jersey, and not one turned up. Not on the bags, the tape, or the suitcases. And this tells you that whoever it was that packed up Bill McGuire's body was wearing gloves. What else do we know? What we know is there was very little blood in the suitcases and in the bags. You heard that repeatedly from many of the witnesses. Very little blood. What does that tell you? Well, that tells you whoever killed Bill McGuire was very nervous about drips, was very nervous about making sure that things were packed up nice and tight. This was someone who took their time and made sure there would be no drips. This person, this killer, was very, very concerned about making a mess. And this tells you that the crime scene was handled very carefully. This tells us that very careful consideration was given by this killer to how this was going to be done and how he was going to be packed. And why put these very carefully bled body parts packed in multiple plastic trash bags, wrapped and taped in suitcases on wheels, because whoever the killer was had to move them and needed to make sure that the move would be easy and expedient, and if someone saw the move of the suitcases to the car, wouldn't raise an eyebrow. So if we know that about the killer, why wouldn't we expect that every precaution would be taken to prevent a messy crime scene? Wouldn't we expect that a killer with neighbors at work during the day, in full control of her apartment environment, would take the time to prepare the room where the shooting and the dismembering would occur? Do we know if drop cloths surrounded the dismemberment? And I'm going to come back to drop cloths in a minute. Do we know what precautions were taken to stop the bullets, wad cutter bullets used normally for target practice? We don't. And the scenarios are endless. But I would be remiss if I didn't point out a few things. But before I point out those two things, I just want to digress for a moment and remind you again, I don't have to prove it happened in that apartment. But whether you believe that he was shot and cut up in the apartment, I submit to you that there is an abundance of evidence that supports that whatever happened started in that apartment. You have the phone calls that evening from the closing where Bill McGuire called the electric company, or the gas company rather, to switch his utilities. You have a call to Hayes J. Penn, one of his friends from Pennsylvania. You have a call from the victim to John Rice, where he was happy and telling them about the closing. Then later that evening, there's a call from Peter Burjenko. Remember, the person that sold Bill the house? And Mr. Burjenko told you that Bill was very good at returning calls, and yet he told you that call that evening, early that evening, he spoke to Melanie. Bill was not available, and Bill never returned that call. And remember, he still had business with Mr. Burjenko because, remember, there was that use agreement. Mr. Burjenko told you he would be moving out not before the closing, but after, and Bill never returned that call. So is it possible that that night, maybe in celebration, they were having a drink when the chloral hydrate was administered? I would say whatever started, that execution started to be, the execution of the murder started in the apartment that night. And I would suggest to you that it's very difficult to move someone who's unconscious, especially in an apartment complex. But is it possible? Of course it's possible. And I don't have to prove it happened in the apartment, but we're going to go over the evidence because I submit to you there is an abundance of evidence that does suggest that indeed it did happen in the apartment. So I told you there were two things that I wanted to point out to you. So let me start with the first one. The trap was taken from the bathroom that had the tub. Remember, it was described there were two bathrooms upstairs. The master bath was the one with the shower stall, not with the tub. You heard Lori Thomas tell you that the master bath with the shower stall smelled bad. And yes, she did testify that it smelled like a morgue. You heard what she said in the grand jury, because Mr. Tacopina had said, you never said morgue before. You didn't say that when you testified in the grand jury. And on redirect, you heard what she said in the grand jury more than a year earlier in 2005. She said it smelled of must, body odor, I believe she called it BO, bleach. It was really bad. That's how she described it. And yes, when she testified here, she said she described it as smelling like a morgue, and she admitted that she hadn't testified to that previously. But let's discuss that. Ms. Thomas described to you that she had recently started a new job working at hospice, and she had had an occasion very recently, I believe she said it was February of this year, of 2007, to be in a morgue at her job. And she described that when she went in there, she was reminded of the smell from this defendant's master bathroom. Now, smell is a very powerful sense. Have you ever taken your kids to back to school night and you walk by the cafeteria and you smell that school cafeteria smell and all of a sudden you're back in high school? Or maybe walking in the mall and someone goes by that's wearing the perfume of someone maybe that's deceased that you miss very much, and all of a sudden you're overwhelmed by how much you miss that person. Smell can trigger memories. That's a very common human experience. And just because Lori Thomas may not be as polished, perhaps, as some of the other witnesses that came before you, and maybe she has had a rough time recently with her personal life, there was nothing to say that she was a liar. It was nothing to say that she wasn't trying to be as accurate as she could with you. And she told you about the odor when she went into the bathroom. We didn't hear testimony from anyone else who was in that bathroom during that time frame between Bill's disappearance and before the move. And as far as other people saying that they were in the apartment, like Dr. Miller, there was no testimony that he actually went upstairs and went into that bathroom. She, in fact, Lori Thomas told you she liked the defendant. She described that she liked her. She thought she was a good nurse. So what would be her motive to lie? She would have been testifying at this trial no matter what to describe to you the smell of bleach. Should she have not said what her recent human experience was? Should she have not given you that additional description just because she didn't testify to it previously? Or is this a search for the truth? She couldn't have testified to it smelling like a morgue in the grand jury because remember, that was in 2005. And this memory that she described to you took place in February of 2007. Bleach, must, body odor, it was bad. I submit to you, those are pretty good descriptive words that may well, in fact, indeed, describe what a morgue smells like. In any event, the important thing to take from her testimony is that the bathroom smelled bad, that the bathroom smelled bleach, like bleach. No other witness told you otherwise. So let's go back to the shower stall. The trap from the shower stall was never taken. And think about how much easier it would be to use a saw in a shower stall as opposed to a tub because you don't have the rim of the tub, the side of the tub to bend over. A shower stall where drop cloths could have been hung to prevent splatter, where precautions could have been taken to prevent anything from going down the drain, and then after you remove the drop cloths, dispose of them, the final wash down is easy. Now, you heard that the Woodbridge forensic team, the one that went in when Virginia was here, they weren't there very long. That was described to you as being a shorter search. Tom Lesniak told you that he did a very detailed search several months later. And I'm going to come back to this in a minute, but remember, contrary to what's portrayed on television, warm, moist environments, remember what Lynn Van Camp told you, warm, moist environments are not good for keeping biological samples long term. Lynn Van Camp told you they need to be dry. She said the best circumstances is dry and frozen, but dry and room temperature was okay too, but they had to be dry. And when asked, what about wet? She said, oh no, wet's not good. Well, I submit to you, months later, after another family is living there and warm water in the shower and steam is produced every day, that's not a scenario, that's not a location that's conducive for DNA to last. And remember, she also told you, again, and I mentioned it already, that if it's bleached, it's not going to amplify. Well, think for a minute of the work that defendant is involved in. She's a nurse at a medical facility that does reproductive medicine. A nurse who would be familiar with what's necessary to do to clean up after procedures. But let's keep going. Why do I suggest drop cloths? Maybe even used drop cloths that were on hand. Think back to Tom Lesniak's testimony. What did he say he found in the bags? Pieces of PVC pipe and paint chips. Where would you find those? On drop cloths that you used before for prior home improvement projects? It's a possibility. Now, why did no one hear anything? Please don't be swayed by this. There were many periods of time where the neighbors weren't home. Nikki Mustafa told you that her family is gone during the day. They're at work and they're at school. And on the weekends, she told you, oh, on the weekends I'm in and out shopping, running errands. You heard no testimony otherwise. And saws aren't always loud. There are a myriad of steps that can be taken to reduce the noise. A towel or a blanket could be wrapped around a saw, just as a pillow could surround a gun. And while we're talking about hearing something, let me digress just for a minute and address something that Mr. Tacopina put up on his PowerPoint yesterday, that a Miss Zhu heard an argument from the McGuire apartment. And the way Mr. Tacopina made it sound, he told you that it occurred specifically on April 29th. The only testimony that you heard regarding Miss Zhu was from Detective Sergeant Dalrymple, and in no way was it established that that occurred on April 29th, or even in the relevant time frame, or even in April of 2004 or May of 2004. You don't know what Miss Zhu heard, or even where Miss Zhu was when she heard it. And if Miss Zhu was a witness to something in the relevant timeline, don't you think the state would have called her?
I just want to correct the record and object that page 175 and 176 of the transcript of Detective Sergeant, first grade, Dalrymple, and I just want to put that on the record.
And again, the jury will employ its own recollection of the evidence in the case.
He asked Detective Sergeant Dalrymple who is the assistant unit supervisor of major crimes, and he in fact is Bill Scull's boss, the person that Mr. Tacopina began his discussion yesterday about. He had asked Detective Sergeant Dalrymple if he had interviewed Miss Zhu and if Miss Zhu had heard an argument coming from the McGuires, and Detective Sergeant Dalrymple answered yes. And he had asked those two questions in a sequence that had nothing to do with Miss Zhu. And I submit to you, those two questions were entirely taken out of context. Detective Sergeant Dalrymple answered the questions thinking that Mr. Tacopina had moved on to another subject area, and then Mr. Tacopina moved back to the 29th. Very clever. And I join Mr. Tacopina in asking you, look at the transcript. The questions have, regarding Miss Zhu, there is no date and time frame. There was no argument coming from the McGuires that night. There was no witness to it. And if there was, she would have sat there and she would have told you about it. But let's get back to the bathroom. Precautions could have been taken, and the evidence tells you that there were plenty of hours where the defendant and/or whoever assisted her could have done this murder and the desecration of his body with full control of the apartment. Now, you heard the defense try to make you believe that the room where he was cut up in would be covered with blood and flesh, so much so that it couldn't be cleaned up. But not so. There was no testimony in this trial about sponge-like grout. The first time we heard that phrase was yesterday. And the bottom of the shower stall, and there's a picture of the shower in evidence if you need to be reminded if you don't remember, it's all one piece. It's one piece of plastic or whatever it is that the bottom of showers are made of. It's one piece. There's no grout. But more importantly, remember what Dr. Gunther told you about her autopsies. Remember how she described to you that she has to cut into the body? She described to you even at one point, which sounded like an awful lot of detail, but she described to you about cutting into the person's head and removing the brain. A full examination has to be done that involves knives and saws. That's what an autopsy is. And yet, do medical examiner suites look like crime scenes? Do they look like horror movies? No. They don't, because the people doing the cutting know what to expect. They take precautions so they can clean it up, and in fact they do, and that happens in medical examiner offices every day of every year in thousands of places throughout this country. They don't look like a horror movie. They don't leave a mess. And they do it because it's a controlled environment and consideration is given to the mess that will be produced and how to clean it up. And I submit to you that's exactly what she did. Now, that shower stall was a great environment for that. Level ground, so the person doing the cutting, or near level ground, I should say, so the person doing the cutting has easy access to the body, and 3 walls and a shower door to prevent splatter. But what else supports the shower stall theory? Well, think back to how Dr. Gunther described that Bill was cut up. Look at the knee cuts. Remember she described they're a little higher in the back. Well, if you take your leg and bend your knee and cut through the knee, if the knee is bent, it's going to look a little higher in the back. So it supports that in this shower stall, in order for Bill McGuire's body and the person doing the cutting to be in there, his legs would have had to be bent. And if his legs were bent, when the saw went through them, remember the knees were cut, according to Dr. Sims, front to back, straight down. That could account for it being slightly higher in the back. And then the rest was, there was a knife that was used. If his knees were bent, the saw would not have been flush with the shower fixtures. There's no reason to believe there would have to be a saw mark on the bottom of the shower. Then what else did Dr. Sims tell you about how he was cut? The next cut was the back cut, but the back was cut back to front. So if Bill McGuire had been in a sitting position when the bottom of it and his lower legs were cut off, as I just described, the person doing the cutting would just have to push his head down and cut through the back. Remember, the saw went through the back, and then a knife was used, according to Dr. Sims, to go through the soft tissue. And if that's what was done, his thighs and lower body would have been beneath him, also preventing saw marks from the shower fixture. And remember, this wasn't something that was done in a rush. She had time. And I'm going to get back to how much time when we do a timeline a little later, but she had time. And if you're looking to make sure that you're not going to leave marks, it's not that hard to avoid. It's not that hard to avoid. So I submit to you the bathroom was cleaned so that no evidence of the body could be found in the bathroom. However, and this is very important, the suitcases contained evidence of the bathroom. I'm talking about the cut hairs. I'm talking about the razor stubble. There may not have been evidence of the body in the bathroom, but there was evidence of the bathroom in the suitcases. You heard Tom Lesniak and Laura Cannon tell you about those tiny hairs. They were cut on both ends, removed from the painter's tape. You see, as air moves through the bathroom, things like hair get picked up. And that's why, for all of us who have cleaned a bathroom, where do you find the clumps of hair? You find it in the corners. You find it behind the heating duct, where the heating duct is, because that's where the air is moving. And hair in the bathroom moves. We don't shave or cut hair in the corners of our bathroom or by the heating duct, but that's where the hair ends up. And that's evidence that air moves through the bathroom and makes things like hair move around. And when they were taping those bags shut, air picked up those little bits of razor stubble like it would in all of our bathrooms, and it got onto the tape. Where else, what other location are you going to find razor stubble belonging both to Bill McGuire and the defendant? Where else? That tells you that tape that was on those bags were in that bathroom. It tells you that that tape was where their razor stubble would be. That's evidence of the bathroom on the tape. And why did law enforcement go back so many times to the apartment? Because everything inside those suitcases was consistent with coming from there. You heard the first search was done by Woodbridge and the next by Tom Lesniak, and he did a very thorough job. The following times he went back were for very specific purposes to make sure certain things were checked. And there was no evidence of William McGuire's body or matching fibers recovered from there. There was none. But as Mr. Tacopina said yesterday, no blood, no DNA, no nothing in the apartment. And I submit to you that sometimes the total absence of something is as evidential as if you find something. You know they lived there. You know they lived there. Why didn't Woodbridge, who searched just days after she moved out, which was still about a month after Bill disappeared, giving her plenty of time to make sure that bathroom was clean, why didn't they find any DNA belonging to anyone in the McGuire family? The bathrooms were scrubbed, and it's reasonable and logical at this point to ask yourselves why. Why were they scrubbed so thoroughly if she was moving out? Think of what, according to her, she was going through. So why were the bathrooms scrubbed so thoroughly? A crime scene unit went in and found nothing. So when exactly was the victim shot and cut up? We may never know. But think back to something Cindy said. Cindy Lagash told you that later in May, the defendant complained to her after Bill went missing that she found soiled underwear in his closet. Soiled underwear. Underwear with feces in it. When do you think that happens? When you're heavily sedated for more than a day? When you die? What do you think happens when you die? I submit to you there's probably a little truth in that, and the defendant probably did deal with a pair of Williams soiled underpants, and it was because of her own actions. Think back to her story. Would a man who supposedly gets enraged that there's a dryer sheet left in the laundry leave soiled underwear in his closet? Does that fit with anything you've heard, except for the fact that you know she filled that prescription for chloral hydrate, she bought that gun, and she killed him? She was meticulous. And as I already said, this isn't a contest between what facts we can discern and which we can't. But not knowing the exact time or the exact location when that man took his last breath in no way exculpates this defendant. It is exactly what we would expect from her. You heard Dr. Gunther tell you that decomposition is dependent on temperature. And we have no way of knowing exactly when Bill was killed and cut up or how she maintained the body parts after that. I submit to you that inside the shower stall, once the body was cut and bled out and bagged, she could have simply surrounded them with bags of ice, which makes sense with the decomposition you heard about. Dr. Gunther told you that the legs looked fresh. She didn't use the word pristine. She said they looked fresh. And I'm going to come back to Dr. Gunther in testimony. But she said she can't tell how old they are because it depends on the temperature they were kept at. So wouldn't the smallest of the body parts, the legs being the smallest, wouldn't they be the easiest to cool? Wouldn't they be the easiest to cool and the ones that would stay the freshest looking? And I also submit to you, he may not have been cut up all at once. We simply don't know, and I am not asking you to speculate. And while the defense is trying to tell you that this is a problem with the state's case, it just isn't. She participated. If she participated, she was guilty, and that's true whether it happened in the apartment or not. But let's talk about where the suitcases ended up. If you're planning on throwing suitcases off of the Chesapeake Bay Bridge, you don't want to do that the first week in May. Think of what's going on in Virginia the first weekend, I misspoke, in May. You have the Outer Banks in North Carolina opening up. You have Virginia Beach getting busy with tourists. No, if you're going to throw suitcases off the Chesapeake Bay Bridge, you need to wait for a weeknight. You need to wait for a weeknight when you expect traffic will be minimal. And let's look at where the apartment was. You saw the picture. Mr. Tacopina showed it to you yesterday. It was an end unit. It was an end unit right close to the parking lot. It would have been easy to move the suitcases to whatever vehicle she was using without being seen. And if seen, who would think twice? The neighbors knew this family was moving. It was simply someone moving suitcases to a car, not something that's memorable. And there was time to move those suitcases, both during the day, when her neighbors weren't home, and also at night when we know she was busy, because we know about those Atlantic City trips. Please keep in mind that the suitcases and the lack of prints and the lack of blood tells you that this killer was very careful and very organized, and you would expect this killer to clean up behind her. But what other evidence do we have of the apartment? Two other big considerations that I ask you to think about. First, we have the defendant staying at a motel starting on April 29th. And you have to ask yourself, does that make sense? If she was honestly afraid that her husband was going to come home and be violent with her, if safety was her issue, Wouldn't she want to be with her parents? Wouldn't she want to be with her children? Is an hour to drive to Barnegat, Woodbridge to Barnegat, an hour or less to drive too much to feel safe and be with the people you love? Absolutely not. If safety were her issue, she would have been with her parents. And what else supports that? Well, if she's concerned about being safe and is going to stay in a hotel, is she going to pick one just down the street from the daycare center where she's afraid her husband is going to go? Because remember, she's getting a restraining order to keep him away from the kids. A hotel where there is no hallway, where the cars can drive up and go right in. Is that where you would go if safety was your issue? If you had to stay in a hotel, wouldn't you want to be in one with a lobby? One where if somebody going to your room, coming in at night, was going to have to go through security, was going to have to pass the lobby desk and the bellhops and everybody else? Why would she be at that hotel? And she stayed there until Sunday. And remember why she said she was staying there. I have to get the restraining order. I wanted to get my lawyer. I'm getting a divorce. Well, family court and most lawyers' offices are closed on Saturdays and Sundays. And as for the money spent on retaining a divorce lawyer, ladies and gentlemen, I submit to you that she was purchasing a defense argument and felt it was money well spent. She wasn't in that hotel to get the restraining order and get the arrangements made for the divorce. She was in that motel because it's very likely that Billy's body was in that apartment. You heard no one. You heard from no one who was in that apartment between April 28th and May 5th. No one. And if you still aren't sure about the apartment, I'd ask you to consider something else. I'd ask you to consider her pattern of excuses. But in order to do that, I have to digress for a few minutes. I promise you I will come back. Please consider first what we know about the gun purchase. Go back to the emails to Jim Finn. Now, Jim Finn was an interesting man. He clearly had very strong feelings for this defendant, and he was also very vulnerable to her. She knew all the compromising things about him that Mr. Tacopina was able to ask him about on cross. Remember, it was the defendant that picked him as a witness in this case. It was she who called him to ask about the gun. She manipulated him. She flirted with him when she needed something and then pushed him away, figuring that later she would suggest to him whatever she wanted and whatever context she wanted his memory to be in, and it would be okay because she knew he had feelings for her. But you have to ask yourself, why is she going to keep the card that he sent her flowers on? Why would she keep that? It's proof of manipulation. It's proof of, well, just in case, let me hold on to this. And in the call that Mr. Tacopina played for you yesterday, when she told him that she didn't want to coach him, what she was trying to do, ladies and gentlemen, was settle him down and then distance herself from him. She didn't want him to be her witness with the police. She just wanted him not to go into detail about the discussions about the gun. She wanted to settle him down and distance herself from him. She only told Jim Finn what the police already knew at that time. She didn't confide in him. Remember, she even said it on the tape you heard yesterday regarding Delaware. She said, Celine told them that yesterday. Celine told them that. The yesterday refers to you heard the call yesterday. Celine told them that. Them as law enforcement. She was telling Jim Finn, they know I was in Delaware already. They know that. She didn't take him into her confidence. But you remember the emails because she was telling him that Bill was acting weird and she was considering some heavy changes. She used Jim Finn. And we'll come back to this later in the timeline. When she needed something, she would call him, and then when she didn't, she would push him away. He wasn't one of her best friends. He told you he saw her at the Middletown Diner in September of 2004 and then hadn't seen her since. But you don't have to decide whether or not you want to believe Jim Finn. You don't have to decide that because you have the emails themselves. And I'm going to go through them in the timeline. but I just wanted to show you one. And this one, and again, you've already seen it, this is an excerpt of State Exhibit 1056, where he tells her, "I'll definitely help. I feel like I'm in a Robert Ludlum espionage thriller," because she doesn't want to do it on the phone. And then he asks her the question later on, "Now for the obvious and most important question, are you safe? Are you safe?" That's what the discussion was about. It wasn't, "Gee, my husband wants a gun, Jim. I'm looking to get one. How could I do that?" And there's a reason for that, and we'll come back to it later. Now, flash forward to the consensual. And by the way, let me talk to you for just a few minutes about consensuals. Why do you think law enforcement uses consensuals? It locks in both parties on the tape. It locks in both. If Jim Finn had been involved in it, you would expect, when he's asking questions, the response to be, "What are you asking me that for? You were there with me." It locks in both parties. So we're not hearing testimony from Jim Finn about what the conversation was. You heard the tape. You heard it accurately. And whether or not you believe everything Jim Finn said on the stand, you have the emails and you have the calls. And I just want to play for you. I was going to play more, but actually Mr. Tacopina did quite a bit yesterday. I just want to play for you one quick little session. And you know what? We'll go on and skip that, and I'll ask Ms. Soltansky just to get set up for the next one. You heard it yesterday. You heard the surprise in his voice when he said, you bought it for him? You bought it for him? He was surprised. He never knew that. Now, when you put the consensual and the email next to each other, are you ready? All right, let's play it.
It's just, dude, I have so much shit going through my head right now. I mean, because I talked to you about buying a gun.
The reason I asked you about buying a gun is because my husband wanted one.
He wanted one.
Yeah. Not only did he want one, I bought one for him. This is stuff I couldn't tell you on my phone.
Why didn't you tell me?
Oh, I wasn't about to tell you over the phone.
Well, I assume you got it legally.
In Pennsylvania.
Why wouldn't she tell him on the phone? You know Mr. Finn told you about conversations that went along with the emails, and he explained to her how to purchase a gun when he was thinking that her husband was acting weird and she was afraid. So why wouldn't she tell him on the telephone, "I'm buying the gun for my husband"? Why wouldn't she? It doesn't make sense, and it doesn't make sense because it's not true. Let me mention something else that was raised yesterday regarding the gun. You heard from Mr. Lowry on the defense case, who told you, and this is in the transcript, he had a conversation with Bill about purchasing a gun. But there is no evidence before you or during this trial that Bill wanted to purchase a gun. Look at the question and look how it's worded. And also, please be reminded with Mr. Lowry, he was interviewed 3 times, if you remember. The first time was in August of 2005, where he had told the detectives that he had read the Peter Harvey letter. And I'll just remind you, we'll get to the Peter Harvey letter, but the Peter Harvey letter mentions, no surprise that Billy Mack wanted a piece, and I'm paraphrasing, so please, if that's a little off, go by what the letter says. But it was in the letter that Mr. Lowry read before he was interviewed in August of 2005, yet there's no mention to investigators about the gun. And what did he also tell you? Oh yeah, I do remember the conversation about reading things in the newspaper and not confusing it with the memory. And you heard the cross-examination where in the report he had had lunch, there was a third person present, but now, oh no, that was a different lunch. It was a very, very, I submit to you, he is a difficult witness to believe. I believe Mr. Lowry may have been trying to tell you the truth, but I submit to you, I wouldn't put much stance on what Mr. Lowry said. But even so, what he said was there was a conversation with Bill McGuire about purchasing a gun, not that Bill McGuire wanted to purchase a gun, and that's a very, very distinct and important difference. There is no evidence before you except for what the defendant says herself as an excuse that Bill McGuire wanted that gun. And what's the next excuse she uses? The car at the Flamingo. Look at her actions during the day on the 29th. Calling lawyers, going to family court, checking into the motel, telling Brad Miller that she's doing it because she's afraid, telling Donna Todd from Kindercastle that she's getting a restraining order against Bill. She's seeking a restraining order to keep him away from her and her children. She goes on the 29th and the 30th, yet you heard the proceedings from the 30th from in front of the family court judge. You heard her tearing up and the judge reassuring her, don't worry, Miss McGuire, don't worry, you're safe. But where do we later learn that she went in between? In between the first and second visit to family court, she went to Atlantic City and parked Bill's car at the Flamingo Motel. And when does this come out? It doesn't come out the next day. By the way, Brad, you know what I did last night? Last night I was so angry that I went down to Atlantic City and I can't believe he left me and I moved the car. Was that what happened? No, that wasn't what happened. No one was told about that move until a month later. And you know who some very specific no ones were that weren't told about that? The Virginia Beach detectives. Did she tell the Virginia Beach detectives that she knew Bill was in Atlantic City because his car was there? Did he say that? Did she say that to them? And don't you think that when the father of your children is murdered, you would want to tell the detectives everything you know to find the killer of your husband? Like him or not, about to get a divorce or not, don't you think she would say, his car's in Atlantic City, he was in Atlantic City, find his killer, find who killed the father of my kids? Didn't happen. Did she tell the family court judge that she believed he was in Atlantic City when she was asking questions about where to serve him with the restraining order? No. It ended up the address was the Asbury address of the new house. And she didn't tell the judge about moving his car to the Flamingo. She didn't tell the police about moving the car to the Flamingo because she didn't move it to the Flamingo. She planted it at the Flamingo, and make no mistake about that. Look where the Flamingo is. Chris, can you just hold it up so the jury can see? Look where the Flamingo is. You have the Taj Mahal and the Sands, all the way over here in Atlantic City. The Flamingo Motel, all the way down here. Thank you. And I'm going to come back to that. Please keep in mind those locations. So how unreasonable is the excuse that she drove down to Atlantic City and just happened to find his car? Well, I'd ask you to think again about another human experience. When you go shopping, when you go to the mall, and when you go to the mall and you're trying to remember where you parked the car, when you're trying to remember where you parked it, how long does it take you to find the car? And that's your own car when you're trying to remember 5 minutes. She goes down to Atlantic City with all of those businesses, all of those casinos, all of those hotels, and she finds his car. She just happens to find it. And if you weren't certain that this is a tall tale, then we have the cab rides. And Investigator Janowick told you that the cabs that service the Woodbridge train station are mandated to keep records, and there were none. And further, and importantly, if she had really lost her car, if she had really lost her car in Atlantic City, why is she taking a cab all the way up to Woodbridge when her parents live in Barnegat? If she really lost her car in Atlantic City, why wouldn't the cab ride be to her parents' house? That would have saved her more than an hour each trip, more than an hour up, more than an hour back. And I submit to you that there were no cab rides. And very importantly, ladies and gentlemen, if there were no cab rides, then there was an accomplice. Let me say that again because that's important. If there were no cab rides, there was an accomplice. Because otherwise, how did she get back to her own car? And if that's still not enough to tell you that her finding the car and moving it is a story, look at the red roof record. The red roof record tells us that she checked in, and it's the highlighted portion here. She checked in at 9:09 p.m. on the 29th. So she checks into the red roof, and again, she checks into the red roof, just to remind you while we have the exhibit, using the Forest Haven Boulevard address, asking for a 7 o'clock wake-up call, but she checks in at 9:09. So even assuming she just goes to the room for a few minutes and she's on the road 10 minutes later, when would she have gotten to Atlantic City? If she left Edison, if she left the red roof, which is on the border of Edison and Metuchen, if she left the red roof at, let's figure, 9:30, just to make it easy, she's not in Atlantic City till at least 11:30. At least 11:30. Probably even a little later than that. And when did she park the car at the Flamingo? 12:40. So that would mean that she would have had to get to Atlantic City, arriving there 11:50, 11:40, 11:50, find his car. And remember, she has no idea where in Atlantic City it is. And I submit to you, even if she went to the Taj to look for him, the parking lot is so big it would have taken time. She goes there, she has to find his car, she has to park hers, then she has to drive through Atlantic City with the stoplights and everything else. She would have to drive all the way down to the Flamingo and park his car and be there by 12:41, which I believe is the time on the security tape. And I submit to you that's just not possible, and it's not possible because it didn't happen. The much more logical and reasonable scenario, again, is that someone went with her, which is consistent with what Nicole Spawn saw in the tape, consistent with another car being her pathfinder, and whoever was helping her was in it. And that they planned to leave it at the Flamingo, and that was planned in advance. She met her accomplice, drove Billy's car and the other car to Atlantic City, parked it, and then they left together. And I just want to refer you to the phone records. She checked into the Red Roof Inn at 9:09. She made a call to the Caporero house at approximately 9:18. Now add in the 2 return trips to Atlantic City. She goes down again May 2nd at 12:54 a.m., 10 minutes to 1 in the morning, and May 18th at 5:47. And another reason to be certain that it's an excuse with the car is look at the Easy Pass record. She told Brad Miller those 2 trips were to check on the car, yet she calls and protests those 2 45-cent tolls. And we already talked about the timing of that. Day after Virginia Beach's first interview, same day that she met them at the storage facility. And once she's told that the record is going to stay, she admits it to Brad Miller. And that tells you a lot. That tells you that she's not being truthful. It tells you that she was hiding whatever it was that she did, and it tells you she's guilty. And importantly, yesterday, Mr. Tacopina told you that she panicked and called Easy Pass and said she wasn't there. Does that make sense? Does that make sense? The Virginia Beach police detectives are investigating the murder of my poor husband, and they asked me some questions, so let me call Easy Pass and get my record cleared that I wasn't ever in Atlantic City. She was distancing herself from those cars. And I want to tell you, I agree with Mr. Tacopina that she was panicked, but for a whole different reason. She was panicked because she killed her husband, and those detectives were asking her questions, and she was getting nervous. So the second excuse is moving her car. And you heard her excuse. Oh, I was there innocently. I would have popped his tires, but I didn't have a screwdriver. Importantly, she also tells Jim Finn that, and she told Brad Miller, that she found Billy's cell phones in the car and takes them and throws them out. So even according to her story, she had Bill's phones after 12:40 a.m. on April 30th. I submit to you she had them the entire time, but even according to her story, she had them after 12:40 a.m. on April 30th. And on April 30th at 5:41 p.m., I submit to you that it was this defendant that placed a call to Billy's best friend, John Rice, and left no message. We know that it wasn't Bill, first because she had his phones, and second, John Rice told you when he testified that when Bill called the house and they weren't home, he would leave a message on the answering machine. There's no reason to believe he would have done any different then. She also must have forgotten what she said to the Virginia Beach detectives and to Cindy Lagash. She said that Bill called their apartment on May 2nd and didn't leave a message. She even told Cindy Lagash told you when she testified that the defendant said she tried to take a picture of the caller ID, but the picture didn't come out. She was trying to create the illusion that he was alive. Look at the timing of that May 2nd call. You have her hitting on one of those disputed Easy Pass hits on the Atlantic City Expressway just 16 minutes earlier. And isn't that smart of her? Isn't that smart? Because if Virginia Beach had gotten the cell site information, which was explained to you during the trial that the cell site information was gone before it was obtained, but if they had obtained the cell site information for Bill's phone, where would it look like the call came from? It would have appeared that the call came from Atlantic City. She set it up so it would look that way. She needed to create the illusion that he was alive. What else did she do to do that? The BlackBerry message to his job sent to his boss at the wrong email address. You heard Tom Terry and Ben Steinhauser tell you that Billy was a proficient email user. In fact, he was the email administrator. He frequently communicated with Tom Terry by email, and yet the message to Tom Terry is sent to the wrong email address. Why? Perhaps because Bill's wife knew Bill's email address was bill@njlinks.net, and she assumed Tom would be tom@njlinks.net. She sent the message, and it's easy enough to click a BlackBerry one too many times and save it in an address book. Because it's in a BlackBerry address book doesn't make it right. You could save wrong email addresses all you want, and that's what happened. She sent that message to make it look like Bill was alive. She was trying to create the illusion, and ladies and gentlemen, I'm asking you to please see through it. Remember the BlackBerry, where was it recovered? It was recovered from his car. It was recovered from his car. She had the BlackBerry. And when she called Easy Pass, she didn't want the record to put her near Atlantic City on either of those dates. She told Brad about it months later, that she and her father had gone to check on Bill's car. And remember what Investigator Del Grasso told you about the Easy Pass lanes on the Atlantic City Expressway. He said all of the lanes had Easy Pass transponders, and that's something we're all familiar with. Sometimes lanes are Easy Pass only, sometimes it's Easy Pass or cash, sometimes it's cash only. But it wasn't cash only on the Atlantic City Expressway. They all had Easy Pass transponders. So perhaps she believed that she had paid cash and her transponder was picked up anyway. And while we're on the subject of defendant seeking to change the Easy Pass record or panicking, using Mr. Tacopina's word, it's important, I think, to see the picture of what was going on a little broader. Mr. Tacopina said yesterday, oh, it's interesting, the state wants to call her cunning and meticulous over here, and then she makes what we could call these silly mistakes over here. Ladies and gentlemen, the answer to that lies in her prescription record. Look at what was going on after Bill went missing. Around the time that she kills him and he's missing, look at the prescriptions for Xanax. Remember, Dr. Miller testified about them? He said he gave her the one prescription on the 29th after she left, and I asked him, what about the other ones? And there was a back and forth. It could be renewals. Dr. Miller, can renewals up the dosage? Because the dosage doubled. No. She was stressed. She was panicked. And she was starting to make mistakes. She was having difficulty keeping her story straight. What's the next excuse we have? Furniture shopping in Delaware. Yes, in the middle of going from purchasing a new home to her husband allegedly being violent for the first time, to moving in with her parents, she has an apartment filled with furniture that's about to go into storage. She's seeking a divorce. She hasn't heard from her husband, whom, whether she's divorcing or not, she should be interested in if for only financial reasons. She had just gotten a prescription from Dr. Miller for Xanax because she's so stressed. She decides then is a great time to go to Delaware and go furniture shopping. She doesn't have an apartment, but she's going to go furniture shopping in Delaware. And I submit to you that this was an excuse. Why? Because it was something she thought or saw that she believed law enforcement had that would put her there. It was an anticipatory defense. Perhaps she thought we had cell site information. Perhaps she thought we saw her on the bridge. It was an anticipatory defense. And besides that, the assertion that she went furniture shopping is absolutely incredible. What do we get from the calls? Let's listen. It's just little snippets, I promise.
But this is other thing. They said that you went to Delaware with someone, and guess what? They think it's me.
I didn't go to Delaware with anyone. I went to Delaware to look for furniture, and I was in Manhattan that afternoon. So unless I'm like driving at 120 miles an hour, or I took the Concorde,
I wasn't piloting that, by the way.
that's just not possible. And I stayed at my mother's house the night before.
So you did go?
What, to Delaware?
Yeah.
Yeah, just right over the Delaware Memorial Bridge. There's a huge area that has like furniture outlets and stuff. I was shopping for furniture. I was selling all my shit. I was getting divorced in my head. My husband wasn't dead. Yeah, they know I went to Delaware. I went to Delaware to go shopping because I got down there. It was a Tuesday morning. I got down there. Brad called me like he did every morning, and I said something about like what's going on at work. He said, "Oh, just another Tuesday," and I went because I forgot that I was supposed to see Celine that afternoon, and I knew I was never going to get up there. I was in Manhattan. I bought something on my credit card that afternoon. I have my credit card saved.
You went down there after that?
No, that I went to Delaware before that. I went to Delaware in the morning.
Oh, it was in the morning. Oh, okay.
Yeah.
You met up with Celine in the afternoon, right?
Yeah.
All right. But
And I was at my parents' the night before.
Thank you. Mr. Tacopina yesterday said that from Barnegat to Delaware is 45 minutes. I submit to you it's more like an hour and 40 minutes. Delaware to Manhattan, approximately 120 miles, more than a 2-hour drive. So if we're to believe the defendant, we would have to assume she woke up very, very early in Barnegat, New Jersey, drove some other way to Delaware to furniture shop, and then she remembered she had a lunch date with her friend in Manhattan, and decides to abandon the shopping spree that she drove all the way to Delaware for and drive to Manhattan. Ladies and gentlemen, it just didn't happen that way. That was her return trip, all right. That was her return trip from getting rid of the body. And please keep in mind the very straight bridge that would permit you to see headlights from very, very far away. And while we're talking about the bridge, remember the 31-inch guardrail? And obviously what would have been the heaviest of the suitcases? Remember the 9-inch curb where the suitcase on wheels could have been pulled up to the curb? And for a reference to 31 inches as compared to the suitcase, I ask you just to look at this. I'll move it back for those that can't see. Not much lifting involved in this. I would ask Mr. Romanishin if you could bring it around so the drawers on the side could see. Were the drawers over here able to see? Yes? And does the state think that this defendant had help? Yes. Exactly how much help or which parts she had assistance with remains unknown. We know that her father went with her to Atlantic City on those trips that were later disputed. She disputed them because she had to hide them. He was with her. And let me call your attention to some very logical references. The killer wanted to weight down at least one of the bags. Remember, we know there was a weight that was recovered inside. The weight, ladies and gentlemen, was only 5 pounds. 5 pounds, not 25 pounds, not 50 pounds. It was a 5-pound weight. If professional killers had done this, his head and hands would have been cut off and dumped far away from the rest of the body to prevent identification. Secondly, the weight that was used would have been much more substantial. It was a little weight because it was a small-framed woman. Now, let's take a look at the Easy Pass records from May 3rd. And remember what John Rice said and Ray Pickell said, from Woodbridge to the Chesapeake Bay Bridge is about 5.5 to 6 hours. If we look at the Easy Pass records, and I'll show them to you specifically later during the timeline, what we see on May 3rd is quite telling. I'm going to lay out the times the kids were dropped off a little later, but from the Caballeros, you see the Cabalero Easy Pass in use starting at 4:09. There's the Easy Pass hit at Varnegat, then Toms River, then Asbury Park. At 5:44, you see the same transponder from the Caballeros hitting at 5:44, 6:06, and 6:21. Here they're headed north, or whoever it was, whether it be Mr. or Mrs. Caballero, we don't know which transponder went with who, headed north and then headed south. We have at 4:40 the children being picked up at Kindercastle by the defendant. Then we have the defendant hitting at Raritan South. And then a little later, you have the defendant's transponder hitting at 5:26 on Raritan North. And ladies and gentlemen, this Easy Pass record suggests that a meeting took place. The defendant picked up the kids. The grandmother of the children came up north. She went south. The children went into the grandmother's car. And then the defendant goes through Raritan North, which, as all of us New Jerseyans know, would put her right near the entrance to the New Jersey State Turnpike off the Garden State Parkway, where you could head straight out to the Delaware Memorial Bridge and take Route 13 right down to the Chesapeake Bay Bridge. And I would suggest to you that the meeting place probably took place somewhere around the Cheesequake rest stop. Down to Virginia, down to the Chesapeake Bay Bridge and back, would put her back right around the Delaware-New Jersey border the next morning, the morning of the 4th, the Tuesday, where there's a call from Brad Miller at just after 9 o'clock that comports with the defendant's story of getting a call from Brad and going to meet Celine for lunch. And I submit to you, she likely did meet Celine for lunch. The defense put in a charge from May 4th in Manhattan that the defendant made. And I submit to you that the purchase was made to later be an alibi, but she was nowhere near the bridge. But something told her that law enforcement had her near the bridge, and that's where the excuses and the mistakes came up, and we're lucky they did. Now, there's been a lot of talk about how heavy the suitcases were. Firstly, I'd like to just remind you that suitcases are made to make it easy for persons to move large quantities of stuff. And when she dumped him in the Chesapeake, remember, the bags weren't wet on the way in, so they weighed far less. The guardrail could have acted as a lever. We know she's a trained nurse. She's trained at moving persons bigger than her. And lastly, another common sense thought from everyday experience: how many times since the new flight restrictions have you seen people get caught with over 50 pounds in a suitcase? And who does that usually happen to? It's us women with the shoes and the makeup and everything else, reloading and moving things around so you don't have to pay that extra charge, because now the airlines charge you. And the reason it's so easy not to know you have 50 pounds is because the suitcases are made to make it easy to move a lot of stuff. I'd like to remind you that when people need to save a life, we've all heard stories of them being able to lift very heavy objects. And I submit to you that for Melanie McGuire, no life was more valuable than her own. So furniture shopping in Delaware, that's another excuse. Now, originally, remember, I digressed when we were talking about the apartment, and I promised we would go back. I wanted to show you first the pattern of excuses, and I want to ask you to listen to a clip from one of the consensuals that's in evidence. Thank you.
I went back into my old apartment. I didn't sleep there for the 3 nights after he left. And before I basically moved in with my folks, I stayed in the hotel because I was afraid. And I mean, these guys are so rabid. So rabid. And Celine said to me, you know what? They were in that apartment once, they said nothing happened there, and then they go back in. He was like, watch for them to be planting evidence. You know what? Like, listen, I didn't sleep in that apartment. I know that he didn't come home with somebody or looking for me or whatever. I don't know that something didn't happen there, Tina. That fucking scares me.
The picture up. Leave that up. Thank you. I didn't sleep there in the apartment. I didn't know if he didn't come home with somebody or looking for me or what. I don't know, something didn't happen there. I'm so effing scared to say. Earlier, she suggests, earlier up, Celine said to me that they were in the apartment once and said nothing happened. So they go back and watch them. They could be planting evidence. So what is this, ladies and gentlemen? This is the beginning of another excuse that didn't come to full fruition. This is another excuse, but here we see she's laying the groundwork for if something is found in the apartment. And just like she did with the car, and just like she did with Easy Pass, and just like she did with the gun, she's laying the groundwork for evidence that she thinks law enforcement might find. It fits her pattern. But again, you don't have to find that it happened in the apartment to convict. And even if you don't believe that he was killed and cut up in the apartment, I just want to